Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Um, my name is Erfan Ghiasi. I'm an Iranian artist and curator based in Tehran. Since I came back to Tehran, I started working on this project in which I'm trying to sort of bring the Iranian audience further into this artistic and intellectual landscape. And since um, having said that, I've invited Niki Young to be with us today. Niki lectures philosophy at the University of Malta. His areas of interest include 20th and 21st century continental philosophy, phenomenology, aesthetics, deconstruction, as well as the various forms of realism and materialism, currently being developed by a number of contemporary thinkers. He has contributed to a number of publications related to philosophy, ecology, and contemporary art. Young's current research focuses on points of intersection between realism and deconstruction. Today, I know that Niki is working on this very specific subject matter, onto-taxonomy, which is a term created by Graham Harman, but it's in a sense it's an overlooked term. And Niki's sort of mission is to revive this term. I invited Niki to talk more about this topic and how it relates to OO. Thank you again, Niki, for being with us today, as always.
Thanks. So let me try and share my screen. Hopefully this will work this time. Okay, so you should all be seeing my presentation now. Is this fine?
Yes, Niki. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. So the talk is entitled "The Abyssal Rift in the Cosmos," and as Erfan rightly said, that we're talking about a specific concept called onto-taxonomy. Anyway, more about that very soon. So in 2006, in a book called Après la finitude by Quentin Meillassoux, Meillassoux identifies correlationism as the fundamental trait of post-Kantian philosophy. And he names transcendentalism, phenomenology, and postmodernism as the main culprits of this trait. He defines correlationism as famously as the idea according to which we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being, and never to either term considered apart from the other. So Meillassoux basically is arguing that we cannot think being apart from the human or the human apart from being, because the two are always already conjoined. Now, for Meillassoux, the problem of correlationism, is that it prevents knowledge of a non-correlated absolute, namely an absolute that is independent of humans. So the problem, in essence, in other words, for Meillassoux, is that human knowledge is essentially finite. So ultimately, he believes correlationism to be fundamentally correct, so that this situation must be refuted via argument rather than simply refused. Now, there are two main problems, in my opinion, with Meillassoux' solution. Finally, Meillassoux' solution to correlationism remains what Graham Harman calls a philosophy of human access, because it ultimately identifies the real with its mathematical qualities, and therefore what can be known. Now, the second problem with Meillassoux' term is that it is a form of onto-taxonomy. So I need to discuss this term further. So onto-taxonomy was first used in a book entitled Dante's Broken Hammer by Graham Harman. It was for a while forgotten. It wasn't used in any other of his works. But it was very recently revived in some of his very, very recent works, like The Only Escape from Modern Philosophy, for instance, his book Skirmishes, and more recently Meillassoux' political critique of speculative realism. Now, the term onto-taxonomy combines two words, basically. Ontos, which is, of course, being or existence, and taxonomy, the study, the science concerned with classification. So we've combined the two terms. It refers to the a priori classifications of categories of being, basically. So onto-taxonomy always proceeds in two steps. It first ring fences a series of supposedly outstanding traits possessed by a specific kind of being, the human being most prominently. And then from this, it implicitly proceeds to the conclusion that these exceptional features bestow this being with an extraordinary ontological status, which demarcates it clearly from all other sorts of existence. So, in other words, onto-taxonomy assumes a split or a taxonomical difference between two ontological domains, one reserved for human beings, and of course everything related to human beings, for example, rationality, culture, creativity, technology, and of course, on the other hand, on the other side, everything else that is not human, like nature, the world, everything that is mechanical, non-living, and so forth. Now, the term, of course, is developed by analogy to Heidegger's term ontotology, which can be described as the view that one specific kind of being explains the whole of being. Now, onto-taxonomy is different from ontotheology in that it assumes two categories of being rather than one at the root of being. Now, this is important because Harman, who comes up with the term originally, is able to then claim that Heidegger critiques ontotheology, but is ultimately onto-taxonomical, because ultimately Heidegger, as is well known, postulates a fundamental relation, an a priori relation, between Dasein and Sein, or humans. Well, he says Dasein is not necessarily human, but I don't know, and being. Now, consider, for instance, Heidegger's use of the term world, Welt, as the accessibility of beings, for instance. This is how he defines world. It effectively belongs to a relational structure, though, therefore, of man while being in the world. So, also he reserves it for humans alone, as opposed to the animal, who has surroundings, right, rather than a world. True enough, Heidegger sometimes claims that being is never fully exhausted in its manifestations to Dasein, but nevertheless, he also conceives being as a kind of locus of is an excess beyond what is graspable by time. Now, there are effectively two kinds of onto-taxonomy. There is gap onto-taxonomy and correlational onto-taxonomy. Now, gap onto-taxonomy postulates a fundamental gap, a division, a rift between humans and everything else. Two specific instances of gap onto-taxonomy are, for example, most famously, Descartes' distinction between mind and body, and obviously body is understood by him to include, in a very, very broad sense, that includes animals even within this realm. And of course, Meillassoux, who believes that consciousness is so special in the universe that it involves an eruption out of nothing, ex nihilo. So that's a gap onto-taxonomy insofar as it postulates a fundamental rift between these two ontological domains. But then there is, of course, the other side of onto-taxonomy, which is the correlational onto-taxonomy. Now, rather than postulating a gap between humans and everything else, correlational onto-taxonomy postulates a fundamental correlation or suturing between humans and everything else. So, for example, Husserl and Heidegger, to name two prominent examples, have criticized the dualist and representationalist models of Descartes, for instance, but only in order to insist that the relation between humans and everything else takes precedence over the related terms. So basically, correlational onto-taxonomy emphasizes on the correlation between man and being, while gap onto-taxonomy emphasizes on the fundamental rift between man and being. But the two players in this game always remain two and only two categories of being, in the human and everything else. Now, of course, whether one is a gap onto-taxonomist or a correlation onto-taxonomist, the fact remains that both these positions are onto-taxonomical insofar as they mutually start off with the unwarranted assumption that there are two and only two distinct realms, namely that of the human and everything else, which either need mediation and bridging, as is the case with gap onto-taxonomy, or which are always already, so to speak, correlated, correlational onto-taxonomy. Now, there are three main fundamental problems with onto-taxonomy. The first one is that it assumes that the most basic ontological structures can be deduced in advance. And it proceeds to always discuss only this relation between these two categories of being, as opposed to taking a more pluralist view. The second one is its anthropocentric nature, because even if it distinguishes between man and being, the privileged side is always on the side of the human. So it has nothing to say about diverse entities. The third one is that it leads to a division of labor, in which humans are left, philosophy is left to discuss only the human-world relation, whereas the discussion of different non-human entities is largely left to the sciences. Now, Harman's solution to onto-taxonomy entails what I would call ontological democracy, ontological accretionism, and non-reciprocal entanglement. These are my terms, and in what follows, I'm going to discuss these terms in a bit more detail. So ontological democracy is essentially a position which emphasizes on the irreplaceable existence of an indefinite number of singular entities. So for Harman, being is fundamentally composed of a number of entities rather than just two or three, infinitely many, or indefinitely many at least. And each of these entities is singular, right? So Harman is, in a sense, a monist insofar as he believes that being is spoken about in one way, objects, but he's also a pluralist insofar as he believes that there are many of these objects. Now, this position by Harman is known as a flat ontology. And the best way to understand flat ontology is by comparing it, perhaps, to Deleuze's plane of immanence. In his book on Spinoza, Deleuze defines the plane of immanence as the plane of nature that distributes affects and therefore does not make any distinction between things that might be called natural and things that might be called artificial. Now, a flat ontology, on the other hand, argues that all objects are equally objects, even if, of course, not all of them are equally real in Harman's case. So Harman would agree with Deleuze that essentially there cannot be any a priori distinction between the natural and the artificial. But the problem with the plane of immanence for Harman is, well, threefold in a sense. The first one is that it defines entities in terms of affects, in terms of what they can do, the capacity to be affected and to affect. For Harman, this is a form of overmining insofar as it sees entities as nothing more than their relations. The second problem with the plane of immanence is that it is entirely defined, as the term suggests, by immanence alone, whereas Harman believes that an object is always more than what it is currently doing. So Harman's position emphasizes withdrawal rather than immanence. Mm-hmm. So Harman's position emphasizes a mode of transcendence, even though this is not, of course, we have to be very careful in employing this word because it can be understood in many ways. Mm-hmm. Also, there is a universality of being in triple O, much like there is in Deleuze, because being is spoken about, as I've already said, in one way, that of the object for Harman. But, of course, there is also a plurality of objects. There isn't just one. So this begs the question.
Hey, Niki, we cannot hear you. Sorry. Niki, we can't. I don't know what happened. We can't
Is this
hear you.
okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. Yeah. So what is an object for Harman? Well, I was able to distinguish four main theses of Triple O: two negative ones and two positive ones. The negative theses are based on the idea that an object refers to whatever is ontologically reducible. If something is not reducible to its parts or its relations, then it is an object. Now, furthermore, Harman distinguishes between two kinds of objects, namely real objects and sensual objects, each with their own respective qualities. So a sensual object harbors sensual qualities, but also real qualities, whereas a real object harbors sensual qualities, but also real qualities. The sensual is whatever exists in relation to another object, whereas the real is whatever exists in its own right. Now, the second feature or second move beyond onto-taxonomy entails what I would call, following Harman, ontological accretionism. The idea here is this. For many years, metaphysicians have distinguished between substances and aggregates, whereas Harman rejects this distinction between natural substances and artificial aggregates insofar as it assumes an onto-taxonomical distinction between nature and culture, or the natural and the artificial. Instead of this a priori distinction between substance and aggregate, Harman postulates both an emergence and an infinite regress of objects. So we can define what this means. Emergence in Harman simply means that every real object unifies its pieces into an emergent reality that has actual qualities of its own. So, for example, a real object is in this definition is real when it is one rather than many, but when this one is composed of a unification between parts. And the unification between these parts is then able to generate real qualities of its own. And it is these real qualities that are then able to produce what is called the affect. Now, if we were to distinguish the four features of emergence, it would be the following. Every real object has, these are taken from Manuel de Landa's A New Philosophy of Society, by the way, which Harman seems to be partial towards. The first one is that every real object has emergent properties, as I've already said, emergent real qualities, which it harbors in and of itself, and emergent sensual qualities, which are experienced by an intending object. There is downward causation, in the sense that the whole is able to affect its parts, much like, for example, given society is able to constrain and condition the behavior of its citizens, for example, or in the same way as a lizard is able to control and coerce its parts in order to hunt for prey, for instance. The third one is redundant causation, in the sense that a whole can lose or gain parts without ceasing to be what it is. And of course, the last one is that every real object, which is a real emergence, can generate new parts. Like, for example, to use Harman's favorite example, the Dutch East India Company is then able to generate new outposts in different parts of the world. Now, for Harman, every object is composed of parts. And the parts are joined together in a specific way to form a new object. Now, one cannot determine in advance whether something is a genuine object or an aggregate, but we usually can look for clues. For example, if an object behaves as one thing, it generally means that it is an emergent whole, as opposed to an aggregate sum of parts. Now, the flip side of emergence is infinite regress. And for Harman, there is no base layer, right? So unlike materialism, which tends to postulate a basic, the most fundamental layer composed of matter as the fundamental building blocks of the cosmos. Harman argues for an infinite or indefinite regress of objects. And this infinite regress of objects avoids the temptation of either assuming that there is a basic ultimate layer of the cosmos, in which case it would be a form of undermining, reducing everything down to its most basic parts. And, of course, reducing the temptation to explain all the most fundamental, explaining all the plurality of objects in terms of one underlying object. Now, the last part or move beyond onto-taxonomy is what I would call, following Harman, non-reciprocal entanglement. Now, non-reciprocal entanglement is presented solution to the possible onto-taxonomical postulation of a world made up of immanent, holistically entangled entities standing in opposition to human transcendence. Now, this concept emphasizes on the idea of withdrawal. Withdrawal in Harman means that each object is essentially itself, to the effect that direct relations between objects are impossible. However, indirect relations between objects occur constantly. Let's understand this concept better by looking perhaps quickly at the work of Jacob von Uexküll. Uexküll claims that all living things each have their own environment or Umwelt, as opposed to their surroundings, Umgebung. Now, Uexküll says that the surroundings of a specific entity, say for example a tick, to use his famous example, are meaningless to an animal, for instance, to a living being. But the environment is invested with meaning. So, for example, if a flea sits on a branch of a tree, many kinds of things might pass underneath it, but it will only register that which is pertinent to it, in this case, a warm-blooded animal. So in other words, what Jacob von Uexküll is talking about when he talks about this idea of the Umwelt is that every living thing translates every other thing into its own terms. It doesn't have access to reality in itself, because all that it has access to is a translation of this reality, not directly to the reality itself. Now, Jacob von Uexküll relates this only to living things, whereas Harman is more pluralistic in his view, in the sense that he believes that non-living things also inhabit their own Umwelt, so to speak. So each and every thing is constantly in the process of translating every other thing into its own terms. Of course, what this implies is that direct relations between things are impossible, but indirect relationships occur constantly by having one thing translate another. Now, Buchanan wrote a book called Onto-taxonomy, which I greatly recommend. And he suggested that Jacob von Uexküll's concept of the Umwelt hints at a relational account of nature, because there is a sense in which the tick, for example, must be dog-like to form a relation in the first place, whereas the dog must in a sense be tick-like in order to relate to the tick. I however question this, because is this not, this concept of the Umwelt, is this not the same situation as with metaphor? But when someone says the cypress is a flame, the flame must be cypress-like to interact with the cypress, and the cypress must be flame-like to interact with the flame. But this does not indicate that there is an a priori relationality between the two. So the cypress and the flame may very well be independent entities, but there is a sense in which they interact directly, indirectly, by inhabiting the same kind of space, let's say the space of the metaphor in this case. So one important thing that Jacob von Uxkol highlights actually is that an organism and its Umwelt are not entirely different entities, but they form a holistic structure, a unitary holistic structure, whereby the Umwelt incorporates the organism within it. And he uses the example, uses this metaphor of the soap bubble to explain this position. So he describes entities as all being locked up, sort of enclosed within their own soap bubble, such that their interactions with the outside can only be indirect, can only work by way of a translation. Now, as I see it, there are two main problems with Jacob von Uxkol, and this is why I tend to prefer Harman's account, at least if one accepts the modified version of Uxkol's account I've just offered, namely the non-relational one, unlike Buchanan. The first problem with Uxkol, as I see it, is that Uxkol favors life over the non-living. So he believes that essentially the way a living being relates to its environment is fundamentally different from the way the non-living interacts with the environment. And as I see, this is too close to Onto-taxonomy, insofar as it postulates an a priori distinction between the living and the non-living. I think our best way to subvert this problem would be to assume a form of panpsychism. And here there's John Cockburn present in the audience, and we're currently working on a project which deals with this idea. And I think the best way to subvert this problem of favoring life over the non-living, or consciousness over non-consciousness, and so forth, is by endorsing a form of panpsychism, which argues that consciousness is really just a manifestation, a complex manifestation, of something that is going on at a more fundamental level. So this is not to say that all things are conscious, so that I am conscious in the same way as my mouse is conscious, of course. But what I'm really saying is that as real objects, both my mouse and I are capable of forming these indirect relations with other entities. So that my consciousness is simply an evolutionary byproduct of something that is ultimately more fundamental. It's a gradualist approach, and I think it would work better than sort of assuming that consciousness came out of nowhere, this eruption ex nihilo, as Meillassoux calls it, of consciousness, this eruption out of nothing. So the first problem, as I've already said, with Uxkol's philosophy, is that it favors the living over the non-living, right? Whereas I believe that the concept of Umwelt may very well be extended in a panpsychist way to include the rest of all real entities. And the other problem with Jacob von Uxkol is that he sees organisms as experiencing free-floating qualities, as opposed to the object as a whole. So, for example, the tick does not relate to the dog by translating it into an object. It just translates its specific qualities. Whereas I believe that the tick actually relates to the translation of the dog as a whole, and then apprehends its qualities via the sensual object, as does Harman. This is obviously Harman's position too. Now, this brings me to another point I wanted to make vis-a-vis non-reciprocal entanglement, which is the question of how indirect relations are possible to begin with. Well, as I've already said, for Harman, like for Jacob von Uxkol, every real object inhabits its own soap bubble, so to speak. It's enclosed in its own environment, such that direct relations between real objects are impossible. However, indirect relations between objects occurs constantly, or rather intermittently, but it does occur. So the question becomes, if each object is withdrawn into its own specific Umwelt, into its own soap bubble. How is it that they interact to begin with? Remember that Harman endorses a non-relational account of being rather than a relational account suggested by Buchanan's interpretation of Jacob von Uxkull. And the answer which Harman gives to this question of how indirect relations are possible is through his concept of vicarious causation. Now, vicarious causation essentially means that causation or interactions between entities cannot be direct, but they must rather always and only occur via an intermediary or vicar. In Harman's view, there are three fundamental traits of vicarious causation. But I have extended this list to include another three, so 6 in all. And I will go through them one by one. The first of Harman's criteria on causation is that causation must always be vicarious. Well, what he means by this is fairly simple. Since relations cannot occur directly, but nonetheless we also know abductively that relations do occur, then it would be fair to assume that the only way in which relations can occur is via an intermediary, via this kind of vicar, namely a sensual ether which acts as an intermediary between two or more real objects. The second feature which Harman lists vis-a-vis vicarious causation is that causation must always be buffered. Buffered meaning that two real objects can never interact directly because their direct interaction is always precluded via the sensual. The sensual essentially, or the realm of the sensual, acts as a buffer between two real objects and prevents them from interacting directly. Mm-hmm. The third feature of vicarious causation is that causation must always be asymmetrical. We've heard that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. We've seen also in Deleuze's case the concept of affect implies a kind of symmetry, that affect implies the capacity to affect but also to be affected. But in Harman's case, all relations are asymmetrical, meaning that a relation is not mutual. If, for example, a squirrel is climbing a tree, to use an example once used in a critique of Levi Bryant, in a critique of Harman by Levi Bryant, if a squirrel climbs a tree, then the relation between the squirrel and the tree is not symmetrical. Rather, what the squirrel is doing is translating the tree into its own terms, whereas the tree, assuming that it is actually interacting with the squirrel, is translating the squirrel into its own three terms, so to speak. Now, in addition to these three criteria, which were listed by Harman in his seminal essay by now on vicarious causation, I've added three more qualities. The fourth quality of vicarious causation is that causation must always be alluring. And Harman contrasts indirectly. So he doesn't often speak about this directly, but in his 2005 book, Guerrilla Metaphysics, he kind of makes this implicit distinction. And I feel that it is important enough to highlight here. Harman contrasts allure with a state of sincerity. So sincerity is essentially the standard state of things, the way in which things usually relate to one another by translating each other into their own terms. So essentially, sincerity would be analogous to Jacob von Uxkull's concept of the environment, which is the idea that every object only translates other objects into their own terms, but only objects which are pertinent to them, so that not everything is related. Now, In the case of sincerity, one real object intends another real object, but it only relates to a sensual caricature of it. So if we take the example of the tick and the dog, in the case of sincerity, the tick intends the dog, but it only succeeds in relating to the sensual object dog rather than the real dog itself, which is by definition withdrawn from direct access. That is sincerity, and that is the way things often relate to one another. But Harman distinguishes this state of sincerity with allure. Now, allure is occasional. Occasional here is to be understood in two senses. The first sense of occasional is that it is intermittent. So to say that something happens occasionally is to say that it's not very often. And sure enough, Harman believes that real connections are only established intermittently. We can compare this actually to the idea of Badiou, right, in Being and Event, where he believes that events are relatively rare. Now, allure is intermittent, is occasional in this first sense, in the sense that it is intermittent. Change is not constant. There is not some deep layer of constant change. Change is intermittent in triple O. But it is also occasional in the sense of the medieval concept of occasionalism, the modern concept of occasionalism, right, which is already found in the Islamic tradition way before, and depending on which literature one consults, maybe way before that, within ancient philosophy. Now, this occasionalism refers to the idea, as we all know, it's associated with Marquage, and it refers to the idea that things don't interact directly, but rather there is a third term which acts as the occasion for their relation. And sure enough, Harman believes that there are circumstances where rather than a situation of sincerity, a situation in which an object intends another real object but relates to a sensual one, a real object is able to detach the sensual object from the sensual qualities and use these sensual qualities to direct itself towards the real. So, for example, when the tick is intending the dog or senses the dog, that would be a case of sincerity. But when the tick jumps onto the dog, that would be a case of allure, because there we have a relation between two real objects rather than one real object in contact with a sensual caricature. The fifth quality of vicarious causation is that causation must always be, for Harman, binary, meaning that connections between objects occur only between two and only two objects, so that if more than two objects interact, there is either kind of a slow accretion of their parts, with one object interacting with another and then another interacting with another until they form chains, or an object growing slowly, accruing new parts as it goes along. Now, the last feature of vicarious causation is aesthetic. This is quite an interesting aspect of triple O, because here, what Harman is essentially saying is this. Very often throughout the history of philosophy, we find the idea that reality is not as it seems, that the surface is pure, a pure facade, and that the real relations, the real work goes on in the background. Mm-hmm. By saying that vicarious causation is aesthetic, what Harman essentially means is that all relations first occur via the sensual realm, and that all objects use this sensual realm in order to ultimately form relationships with a deeper, with another real object itself. Okay, thank you for listening to me. I hope I haven't over. No, I think I'm good on time, and I think I can take some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Niki. It was amazing. Uh, if anybody has any questions, you can.
I hope it was clear. I
It
tried
was
to
clear. Yeah.
cram as
Absolutely.
much
Yeah.
as much
Yeah.
into the talk
Absolutely.
as I could.
Yeah, Iman.
Well,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
Hello, and thank you, Niki and Erfan, for this talk. It could take a few minutes. I'm sorry, it's rather a long question.
Mhm.
As you noted, a primary aspect of ontological taxonomy is its anthropocentrism.
Mhm.
And that is the primacy of uh, or a centrality of the rift between human beings and the world.
Mhm.
This loneliness of humans on one side of this correlation has led to some sort of pessimism, which you can trace back, I guess, to Schopenhauer, and then and you can find it in different philosophers such as Hartman, uh, Meinlander, Zapffe, Ligotti, and others. And now there's also Nick Land. I have translated both of his horror novels in Farsi, and, and I think that Nick Land also is to be blamed of this sort of pessimistic anthropocentrism because he sees a rift between the human beings and the inhuman world, or which he sometimes refers to it as technology, and this technology threatens to destroy human. So my question is, can we perhaps, despite himself, accuse Nick Land of anthropocentrism? Thank you.
This is a a complex question, but oh man. Okay, so I'm just going to answer you off the cuff here because I'm going to try and answer this question because it really is something I need to really think about at great length, and it's a great question actually, because I do tend to believe that pessimism is deeply rooted, and perhaps obviously perhaps John can also help me out with this question, because he's way more knowledgeable on Schopenhauer's work than I am, definitely. But I think that largely, I'm just thinking here, so I haven't thought about this at great length before, but it's interesting that pessimism generally proceeds with the same kind of assumptions as anthropocentrism, which is the idea that kind of like consciousness is something very, very kind of there is this detachment from the world, sort of, and that consciousness is something different from the rest of being. And it is this kind of like loneliness in the universe that tends to lead some people into this kind of cosmic pessimism, so to speak. But the way to subvert it, I think, and I'm not sure here I'm answering your question really, is precisely by adopting a form of panpsychism. Now, of course, here, if you adopt panpsychism, you can be accused of a number of things like animism and vitalism. I don't think it has to be that way, but I'll leave that discussion to a different time. So if we assume a panpsychism, then we can kind of block this thought that human consciousness is so radically different to everything else that we all are left kind of like to our own devices in a cosmos that is essentially impersonal and ahuman. And in this way, we can perhaps subvert this pessimism by seeing humans as deeply embedded within a cosmos that is a lot more like humans than we would assume through our thought. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, Iman. I mean, I tried to think fast. It's a deep question, and one which warrants a lot of thought here. Yeah.
Thank you. Not sure if John has anything to add.
Yeah, I tied to questions, and I want to bring Schopenhauer in actually to the discussion in terms of the way that Niki set up something which I think is a little bit different from Harman sometimes, by privileging allure versus sincerity. So first, just a clarificatory question. On your account, the vicar with sincerity is the sensual object, and the vicar, in the case of allure, are the sensual qualities.
In the case of it's all about direction, I think, and we've had these discussions before. I think it's all about the direction of the qualities. In both in sincerity and in allure, I think that the vicar is the intentional relation as a whole. So this is always the vicar rather than the sensual on its own. Because as anyone into O knows, for Harman, the sensual relation itself is not just free floating, but it occurs within a more total relation, which is the intentional relation as well. Now, I think that in the case of sincerity, what's happening is this: that the sensual qualities are pointing towards that the real object is that. Okay, so if we see, I will draw it because this is the easiest way to do this. So in the case of sincerity, I think the real object is going this way in terms of its real qualities. I don't know if you can see. So it's the real object going the sensual qualities are emanating from the real object, even if they are always tied to a sensual object in the intentional relation. Whereas in the case of allure, I think it would go the other way. So in the cases of allure, the direction of this arrow reverts to the point that it goes from the sensual qualities to the real object. And I think this is how, at least if I've understood Harman's concept correctly, this is, I think, how objects are then able to indirectly communicate with the withdrawn real object. And I think the best way to understand it would be Heidegger's famous example of the hammer. You know, when as one is hammering away, that's a case of sincerity, of course, because it's the carpenter translating the hammer into their own terms. But when the hammer breaks, that is a case of allure, because suddenly there is no longer a moment where the real object is being translated into its sensual qualities. Suddenly the sensual qualities are pointing towards the real object. And I think this is the best way to make sense of this concept or this difference between allure and sincerity.
And I think that has a tie to Schopenhauer that's interesting. It's hard with Schopenhauer because there's three levels. There's will, there's the causal realm where the principle of sufficient reason takes place. Then there's a Platonic realm on top of that. And he's not always consistent. So in experience of pain and pleasure and frustration in your body, that's the direct experience of the world for Schopenhauer. It's unmediated. So that's where it's not like, oh, well, but when he talks about the Platonism and his philosophy of art, I think there's a aesthetic direction following the way you're articulating this that's different from Harman's book on art. So for Schopenhauer, he's reading the Vedic sources, the first translations of the Upanishads, so he's kind of trying to make sense of this. But if you suppress your ego, you can see the essences of things. And he sets that up very much like OLO. And like Chalmers' big argument for panpsychism now is that science just gets you relations, causal relations, and conscious experience is purely occurrent in some way. That's just sort of the argument. And Schopenhauer makes a distinction. There's like just causal relations but somehow we can grasp the essence. And his idea is that somehow artists can suppress their will but have all this cognitive energy that they can direct to the essence. Then they can sort of bring that back and direct it. And so that's the second way you get to something sort of more real beyond the causal realm, the relational realm for Schopenhauer. And it just strikes me that what you're just, you're describing it in terms of the tick. But in terms of humans, this picture I think is really interesting of allure, where it's detaching from the central object, and somehow the break between the central object and the qualities does something to you and allows you to have a relationship with the real thing that was behind that central, in this direction. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's actually is kind of similar to, this is where, Schopenhauer is non-pessimistic when he talks about a dog wagging his tail. He says that's the only honest thing he can find in the world is a dog's wagging tail. But also when he talks about art and beauty, it's so, I think, I don't know, I want to reread that with the model of allure that you've got. But the question, this is all a lot of stuff. Schopenhauer is very much like a panpsychic in terms of this world of will, which you have direct access into. Mm-hmm. So he's got that, and he defends it in ways that Chalmers defending now, weirdly. But when I look at this allure stuff, it looks more like the Platonism of Schopenhauer. And I'm interested in how that relates to, there's artists among us who, but there's something about the breakdown of the normal sincere relationship. Mm-hmm. And through that deconstruction, directs you to a new relationship with the object itself. Yeah. When I thought about that in my work, I think about it in terms of just teleology, getting out of Heidegger's seeing everything as standing reserve, what we can just use. If we break that down, we can attend to the object as it is. I can try to translate as an artist, but also how do I treat the object? Not just as something to be manipulated. Mm-hmm. But I think there's an artistic tie too when I look at Schopenhauer. So anyway, that's just a lot. Whatever you think about it.
I think when it comes to aesthetics, there must be a connection somehow. So really and truly, Harman's idea of the aesthetic, for example, if again, I'm thinking here it's a bit off the cuff, I'm just, but I think there is a broad sense of aesthetics in Harman's philosophy and a narrow sense of aesthetics. And I think the philosophy of art belongs to the narrow sense of aesthetics. So, for example, if we're talking about metaphor, that is a narrow sense of aesthetics. And the way Harman is doing this is this. He's saying that the real object here is performing the metaphor, as you know. So that the real object acts as the intermediary between the cypress and the flame, for example, or the wine dark sea, or whatever. The wine and sea, or all these examples, or the corpse and the falling, in Dante book, etc. I think that is there is that kind of narrow sense of aesthetics in the normal sense of the term, and then there is a broader sense of aesthetic, which I was referring to here, in the sense that all relations are aesthetic because they proceed via the surface and towards the withdrawal. Generally, when you look at many philosophers, what's happening always is that there is the withdrawal, or rather the depth, that takes precedence over the surface. You can see this in Deleuze, in the distinction between the molecular and the molar, and all this many more of his concepts. Maybe Merleau-Ponty's concept of the flesh might be like this. Yeah, I need to think about that more. There is always this privileging of the depth. Heidegger is another example of a depth philosopher. But with Harman, you get exactly the opposite view, because what's happening always is that there is always this kind of this way of proceeding from the surface to the depth. This is the case of allure. And I think that this is the broader sense of aesthetics which I am using here, which definitely must have some connection to so there must be a connection between the narrow and the broad sense of aesthetics, definitely. As I said, because here it's all about kind of like intermediary. So in the case of a metaphor, if we use the narrow sense of aesthetic, it's the real that's acting as a causal mediator between the two sensual objects in order to form the connection. The cypress is a flame, where the performer of the metaphor is performing it. It's creating the connection. And the same thing must go for this distinction between sincerity and allure. I don't know if this answers your question, John. I'd be happy to expand.
Can I have one more thing? Yeah, because this is really interesting. I think where Harman goes wrong in his art book is where he brings that idea of performance. Mm-hmm. It's the audience performing. It's like if I'm looking at a painting, I'm performing the painting.
Yeah.
And the being of the painting is like this combines me in the painting.
Yeah.
If you talk about the artist performing the object, not the audience, but the artist performing the object to create this, mm-hmm. That looks very much like Schopenhauer and the Eastern traditions that Schopenhauer is responding to. So, like a Zen painter will say, "I became the rose," mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or like Jim Carrey, the actor who, what was the guy, Man on the Moon? Who was he playing? Anyway, Andy Kaufman. He would meet with Andy Kaufman's family. They'd have private times with them because he inhabited Andy Kaufman at such a bizarre degree while filming that. But if you talk as an artist, Schopenhauer has this idea that break the ego down. It's sort of attain a union with the Platonic form and then present that. So I think Harman gives, if you take what he's saying, he's always doing this reader response theory stuff, but if you take it as about artistic creation, if you misread it, mm-hmm. it connects his theory with really older aesthetic views. Mm-hmm. And so what I want to do after this talk is think a lot more about your presentation of sincerity mm-hmm. in terms of that relation, which I think would be a really interesting way to.
Yep. Go. Yeah, we'll also discuss this in our next meeting, if you like, John. We can both.
Yeah, definitely.
Because there must be a connection, because I know that you and I we're working on something at the moment and we're both interested in this. There must be some connection between all the things that we've just discussed and panpsychism. Somehow panpsychism must work through this kind of mechanism, which is both aesthetic in the narrow and broad sense, at least in anthropology. Yeah.
So,
sorry.
Sorry, Niki, you're in favor of panpsychism, right?
Yep. Yes.
What's Harman's reaction to it? Because I know he's against it, like very much.
I've just sent a document actually to John, where I try to track 20 years of Harman's views on panpsychism, and it's so complex, So in 2005 he would say no, panpsychism is out. This is sort of not acceptable. And then in 2009 he says no, wait, but I think it might be a better solution than kind of distinguishing between thought and everything else. So in a sense, panpsychism offers a great solution to onto-taxonomy. But on the other hand, I think Harman, this is where I disagree with Graham. I think that Harman associates panpsychism at times with anthropocentrism, meaning that, which is actually quite interesting, because it is equivalent essentially to Meillassoux' characterization of Harman as a form of vitalism. When Meillassoux criticizes Harman for vitalism, what he really intends there is panpsychism. Harman's a panpsychist. I don't like it, and therefore I don't like this aspect of Harman's philosophy. This is what Meillassoux is essentially saying when he comments about what he calls subjectilism and iteration, repetition. So I think that really the major quarrel that Meillassoux has with Harman is not his vitalism, actually, but his panpsychism. Because I think that despite what Harman may say, as late as 2021, in skirmishes, Graham has been, steadily trying to distance himself from panpsychism. But I think it's because the problem he has with panpsychism is that many people who opt for a panpsychist view tend to think that panpsychism entails that all things are human-like. Whereas I think this is exactly the opposite. To endorse panpsychism is to say that humans are all object-like in a sense. So if we take the basic idea of Russellian monism, for example, there Russell is not saying that everything is essentially conscious in the sense of everything is human-like. It's quite the opposite. It's that consciousness, rather than being something special, must be part of a mechanism that is embedded into the broader context of the cosmos. And I think this is the only way to make sense of human consciousness.
Oh, sorry, may I say another thing?
Yeah, sure.
Because you talked about panpsychism, I recently wrote to Harman about what I'm doing actually, because I also lecture psychology in Iranian universities.
Yeah.
I talked to him about some type of object-oriented psychology, and I talked to him about how it must be panpsychist, and he said, if you tell them that it is that you believe in panpsychist, they will call you crazy, and I don't know how could an object-oriented psychology not be panpsychist. Can you say anything about this?
I think you are muted, Niki. You're muted. Yeah.
Sorry, sorry, man. I missed the last part because I don't know what happened to my headphones. Something went off. Could you repeat the last part? I got the last part where if you say a panpsychist, they call you crazy.
Yes. I asked, what could an object-oriented psychology be if not panpsychist?
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with you, because the thing is, and I don't know. I wish. I think Graham might have. He was supposed to make it, but I think he must have confused the time or something of the sort. It's very difficult when you're dealing with like 10 time zones or I don't know what. But I completely agree with you, because the thing is, if we want an object-oriented psychology, and I think this is very interesting, because very often, you get people saying, "Oh, you can't have a psychology, an object-oriented psychology, because, object-oriented ontology is all about deprivileging the human." Well, yes, in a sense, but that doesn't entail that we don't think about these issues, of course. So to say that everything is an object, includes humans. I think, to answer your question very, very briefly, Aman, I think an object-oriented psychology must be a panpsychism or a form of panpsychism, and it must include this distinction between sincerity and allure, which I've spoken about, I think. But yes, I agree with you, it must be panpsychist. Of course, if we add the caveat that panpsychism does not argue that everything has a mind-like quality, but rather it's the other way around. Yeah. So I agree with you. I mean, Harman is very complex vis-a-vis this issue of panpsychism, and this is precisely what John and I are actually working on. I don't want to divulge too much about our current project, but it's basically a work specifically devoted to settling this issue of panpsychism in Trupelo. And this is what I think. I think that despite himself, Harman remains a panpsychist. Yeah. But of course, we have to properly articulate what we mean exactly by panpsychism. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Because you see, this is the thing. I think in 2005, Harman distances himself completely from panpsychism. In 2009, he says it's a lesser of two evils. And then I think somewhere around 2010, he calls his position a polypsychism. And then in 2021, again, he says, hey, but careful about confusing my position with panpsychism. But still, I believe that the best way to understand his position is as a form of panpsychism. And this is what I want to get into. Yeah. So anyway, to answer your question in very short demand, because as always, I'm talking way too much. My answer is yes, an object-oriented psychology must be panpsychist. I agree with you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, Niki. First of all, thank you for this fascinating talk. I think we should discuss it further because. Let me start with the disclaimer first, because I have to admit that I'm quite ignorant on the subject matter, so I might have misunderstood some of the things. So I have a simple question and perhaps a not so simple question. With regards to panpsychism, would you say that it is a question of equivocation in the sense that you're saying you're a panpsychist, but obviously I suppose that you are redefining the term there. So it's not as it is usually understood. So maybe I don't know. Maybe one should look for a different term, since that term has a specific meaning already. But that's a short comment, and that's a simple question. Now, my second question is about the question of translation. So you were talking about vicarious causation. Now, I'm not familiar with the work of Harman, and I'm not familiar with the work of von Uxküll. Excuse my German. But I'm slightly familiar with the work of Meillassoux, who makes use of this idea. And he takes this idea, obviously, from the work of Maturana and Varela, you know. Now, in the case of Luhmann and Maturana and Varela, translation essentially means that causation is always, in the case where there is translation, obviously, is always trigger causation. What does that mean? So basically, there is a cause outside the system. So whether it is obviously an organism, as in the case of Varela and Maturana, or whether it's a social system in the case of Luhmann, there is so an outside causation, an outside cause. But that causation is understood as trigger causation. So what happens is the cause basically gets translated into the language of the system. That's how at least I understood it. So in the case of the organism, you have, for example, I don't know, someone stabs you with a knife, and what happens is basically that is translated into pain, which you are, or the organism would be able to perceive as pain because obviously of the biological constitution and the nervous system and so on. In the case of social systems, Luhmann would say, so if something happens outside, for example, the legal system, what happens, the legal system translates that into the binary code of the legal system, which is legal, illegal, he says. And I don't know, for example, I don't know, if there is a court case, if someone is accused of murdering someone, and the defense is arguing that the person is insane according to the legal definition, the legal system is interested in, yes, the psychiatric definition of insane, but ultimately it has to translate that into the language of the legal code, which is the legal illegal. So, okay, does it fit into the excusable category, or does it fit into the non-excusable category? So basically, there is a translation into the language of law. Now, my question is, understand that there is translation when it comes to an organism, at least when it comes to an organism that can, I don't know what words I should use here, but that can feel, perhaps. So a tree, I think, cannot feel, as far as we know at least. Whereas I suppose a dog, now a crab, they can feel, a human being, they can feel. And so the translation there, I understand it. So there is a translation. So the stabbing, the injury is translated into pain. What I don't understand, however, is how can, for example, a stone translate the cause into something that belongs to the stone, if I understood you correctly, obviously. So I think if we're going to use the word translation there, and we might obviously somehow expand, what translation means, so a way that we can incorporate also causation upon the stone, we need at least to make a qualitative difference between the two forms of translation. What would you say on this?
That is a very interesting point, Keith, and we need to discuss this over coffee now that we are, because for everyone who doesn't know, we were both locked in with COVID. Keith is a colleague of mine, so now we're free finally, and we can discuss again, and we'll discuss this over coffee definitely, because it's a very interesting point here. And I agree with you. There is a certain sense in which very often, and this is precisely the critique that Meillassoux levels against Harman, but not only Harman, against people like Deleuze, because Deleuze there are similarities here. Anyway, I will not get into it. Arjen Klein-Herenbrink wrote a book, a fantastic book against continuity, in which he gets into all this, all these points. I agree with you, because there is a certain sense in which the concept of translation, for the most part, has been associated with cognition in something like Maturana and Varela. But the thing is, I think it doesn't have to be this way, because actually there is a certain meaning of translation. Okay, so let's take the concept of translation in systems theory, which is very much related to intentionality, and I'm sure you know way more than I do about this. There must be some connection between with social intentionality of Searle's concept of social intentionality, and so anyway, but we can discuss this. But then there is also a Latourian sense of translation, and Latour's sense of translation doesn't involve cognition, because for Latour, for example, the way he speaks about translation in his Pasteurization of France, which is somewhere here, in the last part, the epilogue kind of irreductions of that book, what he means by translation is a kind of form of reduction. So everything translates every other thing into its own terms, and by that he means reduces everything into its own terms. So, for example, an oil rig translates everything it digs out of the ground into oil. This doesn't require cognition. It just requires a process of translation without cognition, actually. And this is the sense of translation I am using. So I think the distinction between, but I agree with you. I think this is a very important point, and I think this needs to be specified more clearly in the things I write in the future. Because I agree with you that translation is often associated with cognition, and I think this is something which needs to be specified. And so the way to do this would be, to answer your question in very short, would be to move from a kind of away from a Maturana, a kind of a systems theory concept of translation into a Latourian actor network theory concept of translation, and that would work for the inanimate in that way.
If I can, Erfan, please ask a supplementary question. But how can you explain translation? For example, you mentioned the oil rig. Let's find perhaps, for me at least, a simpler example, which is the stone. So let's say someone is crushing the stone. So how would you not explain really, but describe translation in that process. Just
Yeah,
to understand, obviously, the idea.
No, I understand, and that's why I said that it requires. Actually, it might be useful to write a whole paper on this because it's really very, very complex, and I'm just now suddenly realizing, and I really thank you for this question because I now suddenly realize how important it is to properly articulate this concept of translation. Because a way to do it would be through the concept of emergence. So once there's an emergent entity, it had those features which I described earlier, one of them being downward causation. And one way in which you can describe translation is as though one thing acts as a trigger cause, so to speak, and that then is able to allow the object as a whole to affect its parts in such a way that it reacts to the specific object. And this is the way it can be explained. I think it's a bit too complex to explain in a couple of sentences here, but I'd be more than happy to sketch it out with you because in person, because I think I need to write something substantial about this.
So John, one last comment and I'll stop. I think I get the gist, Niki. So I don't know if I'm understanding correctly, but I would say it is some sort of mediation.
Yes, exactly.
Is understanding you, but yes, we can.
No, exactly.
But it sounds to me to be some sort of mediation rather than translation, because the notion of translation obviously suggests that there are languages involved, but quite interesting, and obviously thank you for reply. And yes, we can discuss this, and also thank you, Erfan, for organizing this talk. Thank you very much, Niki.
Thanks, Keith. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Keith. Thanks so much. Does anybody else have any questions?
I can touch on that, but if someone else, go first, please. I have two questions, but I don't want to, if anyone else has questions, please go.
I think it's fine. You can go ahead.
Yeah, go, Joe.
Okay, so I got something on panpsychism and something on translation, and the translation is just a comment. I mean, I think that, was that Keith?
Yep, Keith.
Yeah, I think for me the biggest confusion is that part of what motivates Harman is a critique of what he calls textualism. That's thinking of real objects as being sort of mirrors of language, so Hume's bundle theory.
Yeah.
So, but when you say I'm translating the real to the sensual, that makes me think of the real as if it's a bundle of properties. But Harman also talks a lot about the paraphrastic fallacy of new criticism, where you can paraphrase a poem, and you can do it better or worse for different purposes, but that's not the poem. The poem is doing something non-literal. So I think if you think, paraphrase is a kind of translation that's always doomed to fail. Poetry. And translation of the real is always doomed to fail because the real is not a linguistic entity. And so I think that, in that sense, I think Keith that's the appropriate kind of confusion an object-oriented ontology should have with respect to this concept.
Yeah.
But anyway, we can talk about that for the next 2 hours.
And the thing is, and that's also interesting because I think it ties into, like, if we want a panpsychism out of object-oriented ontology, I think we need to also delve very deeply into this concept of translation. So I think it's something which we should work on in more detail.
Yeah. So so thank you for that question. I mean, that was really helpful. All those. But my other thing is about panpsychism. I mean, the root to panpsychism. One thing that makes Harman speculative realism, and me reject this, is that what the speculative realists all did at various things is they took part of the continental tradition from phenomenology or post-structuralism that was correlationist and started experimenting to say if some of these relations describe things in themselves. So Heidegger starts by saying, the object withdraws from consciousness or explicit consciousness or presence at hand. And Harman says in Full Being, wait a minute, what would the cosmos be like if we're not privileging consciousness there? And that's true of any two relations. Same thing with Husserl. Husserl is like, Hume is nuts. We don't just see bundles of properties, we see objects. And Harman says, what if that's true between any two objects? So then I can turn to Harman and say, you're being a subjectualist because you're taking things from phenomenology and speculatively applying them to the universe as it is.
Yeah.
And so I think panpsychism for Harman plays the role of the idea that thinking equals being for Hegel. We can talk about this, but the paradox for Harman, this is where it gets really difficult, is that what you're speculatively projecting on the real is a kind of unknowability. So you're thinking the real as unthinkable in itself, because the objects are withdrawing in themselves. So it's more Zizek'ian than standard accounts of Hegel.
Yeah.
But I just think, for Hegel, to be able to do metaphysics, he has to identify that thinking equals being. This idealism. And that unifies the phenomenology of the logic, or makes the logic possible. Again, I think that where you took this Meillassoux from the Berlin lectures, you're a subjectualist. I think the reason he's saying that is because he sees that Harman, now obviously Meillassoux is doing the same thing and doesn't realize it, but he sees that Harman is taking things from phenomenology and speculatively applying them to the world.
Yeah.
And that's possible if something like panpsychism is true. But again, it's a paradoxical thing because it's this lack or gap or absence in every individual object is very late. So I don't know if you see this panpsychism there. I'm interested whether you see that connection. I don't know if we've had this conversation.
Yeah, no, I haven't actually, and it's an interesting conversation to have. But just to answer you, kind of like I'm thinking quickly here, but maybe a way to do this, because Harman very often, unlike the move with Hegel and but not only Hegel, it's German idealism in general. They tend to think that the real is rational, thinking and being are the same, and therefore the real is knowable, because it's of course, and in a sense, this is also the move that Kant makes with, his transcendental idealism. That kind of metaphysics is possible only because sort of we only have access to the phenomenon, and because the phenomenon is what we have access to directly, as opposed to the noumenon, then of course we can contemplate its fundamental universal structures. I think with Harman, because he kind of his work is so much kind of concerned with the thing in itself, which is unknowable, then he must have some kind of indirect tricks. And it's true that he postulates a panpsychism, as you were saying, as a kind of way to subvert this kind of problem. But I think he arrives at it abductively rather than so I think, again, if we want a panpsychism out of Graham's work, as I think you and I want, then our best bet, I think, is also to consider how Harman is able to make these kind of abductions, as opposed to inductive investigations or deductions, I mean, Meillassoux proceeds deductively, this is fairly clear. He's very much a rationalist.
So the abduction is to posit a central realm in the non-human world, I guess. Is that
the abduction is to say that kind of, because I have no direct access to my wife, then the best possible explanation is that my wife doesn't have direct access to me either. And if there isn't, so if we reject onto-taxonomy, there is not one thing definitely, because to postulate one thing, you have to be different from it, and therefore there are at least two. But of course, Harman says no, there aren't two, there's more than two. So being cannot be a monism, because then something would have to think it in order to think the difference, and therefore there'd be two. But there are more than two. So if a pluralism is what we want, if we want to subvert onto-taxonomy, then we must necessarily understand our relationship to something as similar to us. We cannot know it directly, but we can assume it. We can deduce it, so to speak. And I think actually he speaks about this in an essay. Harman has a paper where he responds to an interview which Laureano Rolon had with was it Leonard Lawler, I think, and Harman responds to Leonard Lawler in this respect, because Leonard Lawler levels a similar kind of attack, a similar critique, on Harman to the one Meillassoux makes, and this is the response Harman gives, and I think it's quite satisfying as an answer. I think that the best way to proceed is through abduction in this case.
I have one more question.
Yep.
Harman at places suggests that there's a difference between science and philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, one way you could try to, in some texts he makes a distinction between theory and allure.
Mm-hmm.
So one way you can say, well, philosophy isn't a matter of theory, it's a matter of allure.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just interested in what you have to think of that in terms of this abduction. Because we're positing a sort of, it looks like a theory of the structure of the cosmos, but he doesn't want us to think of this like it's a scientific theory.
No. I think there is a relation between abduction and allure, actually. And, okay, I'm going to try and explain it the best way I can. Because I'm thinking quickly here, so I'm, I feel like I'm a bit kind of like under pressure to kind of respond as clearly as possible in a limited time frame. Okay, so there is a link between, I think, abduction and allure, because allure is not only a mode of relation, but also a mode of cognition. What Harman calls an unjustified true belief. You're familiar with this, John, from our editing of the book of the reader, and and I think allure is both a mode of relation between objects and the unjustified true belief of what Harman is talking about. So once the hammer breaks and I notice that it is not exhausted by my relation to it, then I can abductively infer that it's more than what I'm currently making use of. And that's the link, I think, between allure and abduction in this case. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
All right, great. Keith, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, quick question.
Sure. That will be. I think that will be that last question, because it's been like a 2-hour.
But
I guess.
then I'll let Francois ask a question, because he hasn't asked the question, and I see he has unmuted. So
okay.
I'll ask him over coffee.
No, Francois is okay. He doesn't need to ask a question, so you can go ahead, Keith.
No, but it was more like the definition of abduction, because I'm familiar with abduction through Bashkar and critical realism. I suppose it means the same thing, but
abduction is the inference of the best possible explanation.
Okay, so that means the same
so
thing.
for example, if my relationship with the hammer can be disrupted, then my best inference is that it is more than my relation to it, for example.
Okay, so that doesn't count as a question then. Okay, Francois.
No, I think Francois is okay. He didn't want to ask a question. No? Okay.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. And it was great. Thank you so much, Niki. Thanks for being with us. And thanks for this great talk and lecture. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
So this lecture is recorded. It will be uploaded on my YouTube channel. I will send you all a link. And thank you all for being with us today. And that's it.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.